继续 Braid 时空幻境的周年重制版，这一期应该是 Design 的第10期了。暂时应该在这个 KC Muratori 这个姓氏，其实在意大利语中我看好像也是念 Muratori 的，不应该念 Muratori。反正听这个 John 他既然这么念，就这么念 Muratori。我操，这个区域打完，我估计就还得再来3期4期都有可能。啥时间你哪个时间了？妈，先从里面开始。啊，这个就是那个 Scuttled Plant 哦，在这个位置。虽然有不少已经灰了，但还是不太好处理。先上去。可以先把需要爬上去的东西搞定啊，或者直接看这个，creating epilogue， 看到啊，放在这儿。
Now there's the epilogue which we mentioned, which is a little bit going the other direction in that it's very obvious. You don't miss it if you get to the end of the game because you have to walk through it to get somewhere.
Right.
And there, I said, what if I have some puzzles and the puzzles are less clearly demarcated as puzzles.
这个是 puzzle 吗？
Prior to this in the game, puzzles are a puzzle piece or a star. So I wanted puzzles that are less clearly demarcated as a puzzle and that give you a less clear reward. They do give you something for solving them.
这是 puzzle 吗？
It's not a collectible. It's not a really discretely countable thing that exists in the game. Do you know what I mean? Okay. So then that in my mind bridges further out to things that were already there from the beginning. I got the idea to put the epilogue in later, but the fiction parts of the game that are displayed before you go into the game, the mission statement was for them to directly relate to the behavior of the world in some way that you could then notice in that way that like, hey, I read things and I notice things. That's a very intrinsic reward kind of thing because there's no mechanism for the game to even acknowledge, much less give you something.
Right, because it would not know if you had solved it. It can't detect that you solved it.
Yeah, and if it's too on the nose exactly even what there is to solve, then maybe that's a little bit too simplistic, right? And so there's also a dimension of you deciding exactly what were the good, valuable things to notice, right? So that's like extremely intrinsic and unguided, and so the epilogue is maybe an intermediate area.
这里真的有 puzzle 吗？我觉得只能爬上来，但是别的什么都干不了。这个算什么 puzzle？ 要么就是一些你看不到能跳的地方。哎，跳上这块石头之类的，有可能吗？没用的，这个真的有 puzzle。来，这里难道是也要？呀，这个地方呢可以通过内侧上来，问题不大。哇，到不了。操！把这看了，这地方你一会儿再来就来不了了。Stars, discussing the star puzzles.
I'm having a little bit of a hard time understanding why you described the star puzzles as hard rather than obscure.
好问题。
Because to me, like, I don't know that I would necessarily say they were hard
until you realize
the way that a difficult programming problem is hard.
Well,
like,
okay.
When you don't even know that something is there,
对的，
I wouldn't necessarily say that was
你
hard.
都根本不知道有什么东西。
Okay. So on the one hand, they are obscure. You don't even know where they are. You don't know they exist until you find one.
Yeah.
Some of them are not strictly harder than some puzzles in the game. But other ones very much are. Other ones are very much about going into this territory that I spoke about avoiding before, of having puzzles be relatively longer sequences of things that you have to do. Some of these are like that. So for example, on the level called elevator action.
那个不会最难的关吗 ？Elevator action，the elevator action star。啊，这个倒不是很难。
On the level called elevator action, the entryway that you get to know about the star is
从这儿往上。
It's messy enough that I wouldn't have put that in the main game. In that, like, there's just a little bit of dexterity and like doing some rewind stuff that has a narrow time window to achieve and has to be executed a little bit precisely.
That's right.
And then that gives you the opportunity to try to get the star. And then the thing that you have to do to get the star is like a little
very
bit
messy.
Grindy in the sense that you probably die a lot and mess up a lot. And even figuring out exactly what to do is less crisp than elsewhere in the game and all these things, right?
あったね。Fickle Companion 是吧？啊，它是这么一个来的。上去了吧，上去。距离设计的刚刚好。The Cloud Star。到这儿来，我操，这最脏的东西。
If they're a little bit different, if they're doing things that are a little bit absurd, so one of the most famous star puzzle, right, that people love to complain
对，这妈等2个小时，啥屌样
？I'm sure I know what this one is.
It's the one where you have to ride on a cloud for an hour and a half.
啊，1个半小时。
No, that's not correct.
2个小时嘛。
You have to wait for a cloud for 45 minutes to get to where you can jump on it, and then you have to ride it for another 45 minutes or so to get to the star. That's not that hard, but it's like pushing at the boundaries of the space in a way that is not totally acceptable in polite company.
Yes.
But like when you're hanging out with your buds, you can do more of that stuff, right?
Sure.
这你肯定要找点别的事儿干干。他在这里说的其实不准确，因为毕竟出这个解说的时候已经快2020年了，这个游戏是2010年前后才出来，设计可能更早，所以他说的其实不算完全准确。一共应该差不多是2个小时，这个云是匀速的，也就等你进这个关1个半小时左右之后，你才能跳上这个云，你才能从那个门那个地方跳上去，然后还需要再等个20分钟，这差不多这样。
So now, when it comes to me, it came a little bit isn't the chronology is
啊，这个就是那个 pattern breaks 嘛。
that
Right.
could space thing that you whack I take that's already very
啊，对
What you mean?，
想起来
I think what I just said for anyone listening is the best explanation that I've ever given of this thing
Of that thing. Okay.
to anyone else.
Where does this the stuff you do in spurring is
When you do it, like we're spending on
a jumper? It's so good.
as
Right.
being and you did stuff on it
Slalom. It's slalom
or whatever.
For some reason.
slalom。
and then you do the jump,
Right.
right? But in reality, like the jump is kind of the point, right?
Yeah,
and
yeah, that's
that
true.
makes it a little
Makes it a
different.
worse
I mean,
analogy.
I could imagine a
所以
game
这个就是
like,
米拉托里。
but I haven't done that game,
Right.
you know. Yeah.
The Fickle Companion Star， 到山那一路过去。Fickle Companion Star，The Cloud Bridge 啊，这个是 Cloud Bridge。啊，然后另外3个门，对，这个很恶心嘛。哎，这不是最恶心的那个。
Another one that I'm thinking of on this level called Fickle Companion.
This level is crazy.
World 4. It's just very explicitly a longer sequence of things that you have to do to get to where the star is.
对，这里应该用 rewind。
That was intentional. It was like, okay, because these are secret and because these are things that dogged players are going to find, they can be a little more messy. They can be a little bit harder. I can play around with that. And it'll also be what makes them feel different from the rest of the game, right? If you have secret puzzles, but they're like the same as the non-secret puzzles, you know, it's a little bit interesting because they were secret. You had to find them, but it's the same kind of thing. Whereas if they're a little bit different, if they're doing things that are a little bit absurd. So one of the most famous star puzzle.
它挤人倒是有点快。这里怎么还有一个？啊，看到了就看到了。
With regard to how did I come up with the different worlds, I just had ideas.
这应该另外一个人。
And of course, I would
这
have
这
an
个 John。
initial guess about whether this was a good idea.
Right.
And some ideas are interesting, but seem like they're going to hit a brick wall really fast. Some ideas sound cool as a high level idea, but I couldn't even find a way to make it actionable, like a mechanic again, right?
Can you give any examples? Do you remember any of these ideas that basically got tabled because they didn't work out?
Well, I could start by talking about ones that I actually implemented.
Okay.
Well, there's two. So you already mentioned that t equals y, right?
Right.
Which is mildly different from t equals x, right? It's the same implementation detail technically. It's like you
Yes.
just decide the other axis
Yes.
is controlling the thing. And interactively, it's a little bit different because it's cute that, you know, you jump, and so jumping has an up part and a down part. So a jump automatically has a forward in time and a backward in time piece.
Yes.
Right. Now, the thing is, the jumps are pretty short in the game. They're like much shorter than Mario jumps for reasons.
Okay.
That, with the other objects in the game, so the primary other object I'm looking at, so the level that was in the early version of the game was the little monster guys being shot out of cannons, right?
Yes.
And because if they're walking very slowly, in the amount of time that a jump takes, they don't go very far. And so they'll
Right.
go forward and back, but there's just not much of a state change that happens there, right? On the other hand, if I shot them out of cannons, if the velocity is really fast that they get shot at,
Yeah.
then they'll change appreciably over a time frame like that.
Right.
But then it becomes kind of hostile to play. And so this one level
Okay.
that I made was you're climbing up a trellis and there's cannons shooting across it, and you're sort of trying to navigate around, find the path up that will not result in you being beamed, right? Which is in some sense a static solution for that exists, because at any y coordinate there will be monsters at any xy coordinate, right?
Right.
And I didn't have a lot of other ideas for it.
Right.
And also the general tenor of the rest of the game is the levels are horizontal and they're a little bit vertical enough to make interesting situations. And suddenly when t equals y, it's like, well, you end up with levels that are probably really tall,
Okay.
or at least levels where you go up to the top and all the way back down and up to the top and all the way back down.
Right.
I was just thinking about what are the possibilities there, and I never came up with anything. Like, there's always this thing where you start with an idea and it's not working out that well, but maybe if you get over some hump and, like, there's always this thing where you start with an idea and it's not working out that well, but maybe if you get over some hump and find a few things, it'll click better, right? It's like two atoms forming a molecule. It's like maybe they repel each other,
Yeah.
but then you get them into the correct energy well and they'll like
Right.
snap into an equilibrium, right?
Right.
Sometimes design is like that, and for that thing I just didn't ever find it. And so then
Okay.
there was still the idea I could keep it in the t equals x world just as an ending thing, like a little punctuation on the end, like a surprise. But the other worlds don't have something like that, and
Okay.
it just wasn't that good in the
Okay.
end,
Okay.
right? So yeah, I didn't. And also, like some of the other monsters, there's almost no interaction with at all. Like in the very beginning of the game, I don't think there were the plant monsters that go up and down,
Mm-hmm.
but those were added not too long after, I don't think.
Right.
And unless I made horizontal ones,
Right. Right.
there's almost no interaction you can have
Right.
between climbing upward and
Yeah.
avoiding those monster guys. I
Yeah.
mean, it could be that they would kill or don't kill like other monsters, but that's
Right.
also kind of statically determined and uninteresting.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah, it just wasn't good, you know?
Right. Right.
And I saw that relatively quickly, although that said, it's possible that I missed something, right? And there would have been something cool there.
Sure. Why the star puzzles are hidden?
So if I may mine the answer to my question out of that answer,
I don't know what else to
which
say
is
about
still
this,
an
man.
answer to a different question.
I don't
think
get
you
it.
did answer the question inside there. But I
Okay.
just want to make sure that
Point.
I'm right
Okay.
about the answer. You said you discover this thing and it's kind of a little magic. It's like, oh, there's this other thing I didn't know about that was in the game. I take it that's really the answer to my question about why obscurity. The answer is because you could have had a door that's like hardcore Space Marines go through the hardcore Space Marine door and nobody else go through there, right?
Yes.
And that would be another way to have
Well,
it, right?
If
But-
you do that,
Yeah.
it seems more like part of the main game, right? It's like, well, this
Yeah.
is advanced. It says it's advanced,
Yeah.
but it's here. So if I'm really good,
Right.
I should go through the door.
Mm.
And it's more part of the normal play experience.
Okay.
So hiding it makes it more exceptional and more extra and more like you don't really have to do this to have a complete experience with
Okay.
the game as a civilian.
Civilian.
Okay. So it's less about, well, it might be partially about making it feel magical to find, but also maybe it's a little bit The Last Starfighter. You've created these secret stars
Yeah.
to find the players who would want to engage with the stars.
Yes.
If you will.
That is not a bad way to think of it.
Okay.
Or similarly but differently, like what's the closest thing to an actual good secret society that you could have?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not like you put a big billboard in the center of town like come do our
Yes.
wacky rituals in the room or
Right.
whatever, right?
Yeah.
But something like this is like, oh, everybody who knows, I mean, ignoring for a fact that we're unfortunately in this world with YouTube and all that,
Unfortunately.
where
Right.
you can go and spoil it for
So now
yourself.
everyone knows, but
Yeah.
Well, surprisingly though, not really,
Right,
because you know, there's a lot of things on YouTube, right?
Right.
But yes,
for the
if you-
first 48 hours, those people, yeah.
or I mean, even now, if somebody picks up the game and plays it, they're unlikely to know about this unless they listened
对的，对的。
explicitly to something that spoiled them on it.
right.
So
反正我一开始还是不知道。
it's still intact, I think, the possibility. And
Right.
even back then, you know, the internet was not exactly what it is today, but the internet was wide. The game was distributed internet only. So this
Yeah.
was
Mm.
known to be a property of the internet at release. And
Yep.
it was just like, okay, I'm still going to do the best that I can do within that constraint.
Right.
But that doesn't but that doesn't really answer my question. So just to be more specific, like I said, I was trying to differentiate between hard and obscure. And the reason I'm asking that is because when I asked why these were put in the game, you said you were interested in having a layer of the game that was harder. While I can
Okay.
make up
No, I
answers to the
understand the question.
I can
And, yeah.
imagine answers to this question, but I want to hear your actual answer, which is it seems like you also wanted obscurity to be part of it, not just difficulty, because those are different things.
Well, here's what I will say.
这
Like,
个是我之前刚刚开始打的头2期，看了 Steam 有一个玩家的评价，他好像说也说了这一点，在他看来，这个游戏的开发者就有意图的搞一个你很难知道，不是纯粹难，这个还是有区别的。纯粹是难的话，如果说那个难题就放在你面前，那么谁都会看得到，只是你有没有兴趣去挑战，有没有兴趣去不断的练习，能够突破它。但它这个星星基本上你是看不到的，就如果说你没有任何一点外界的提示跟信息的话，你可能正常通关你都不知道真的有这东西存在，他就故意搞一个这么模糊的这么一个设定，然后即便你知道了，你要想去攻略它，你会发现难度很大。首先如果你仅是知道有星星的话，那么第一个问题星星在哪儿啊？然后就之前那个玩家评价说了，如果说你去搜星星在哪儿，那么一旦搜到了，你瞬间大脑会获得一大堆信息，就不光这个星星在哪儿啊，到底怎么获取，一系列的这个流程攻略都出来了，相当于它就少了一个这个去思考解谜、设计路线一个这个思考的过程，剩下就是一些操作了，是吧？就是这个 execution difficulty。但这种难题其实2个部分，第一部分是制定剧本，这个剧本怎么设计 然后再是按剧本去实施，两方面其实都挺难的。但如果你真的按这个去搜的话，正因为这开发者喜欢把这些谜题藏得很深呢，当你真的去找到这个谜题在哪儿的时候，其实不知不觉你这个解谜的前半已经被消耗掉了。这倒确实是一个问题。这看看来看他怎么说的。
More challenging and difficult to achieve the full secret thing, like getting all of them, was part of the picture from the beginning, right? Which may or may not mean that any specific puzzle is way hard or not, right? So the cloud one isn't that hard, although you do have to figure something out that's kind of subtle with it. That also, by the way, is pretty tweaky in a way that I wouldn't do. Like even getting on the cloud is a thing that how it works, I just wouldn't consider acceptable for a regular puzzle in the game.
Right.
And so part of what I'm really doing, it's hard, so I'm taking you on a tour of stuff. If you go into this part of the game, you kind of signed up for it, right? You signed up for something a little bit outside the normal part of the game. And this is where, so sometimes people give hate for this part of the game on the internet or whatever, but it's almost never people who actually found it, right? It's oh, I went on the YouTube video that tells me how to get the stars and it's a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
And so
your game sucks.
Or whatever, right? It doesn't work, right? Yeah. Whereas if you find this piece of magic and then you're like, oh my God, where are the other things? And how do I do this? You are opting in to this experience that is at the borders of the game, literally and figuratively. Okay, so you're going beyond the regular game a little bit.
Yeah.
So you're signing up for the special forces in some sense.
Yeah.
Right? And so we can do things because you signed up for that we can't do for most people, right? And maybe you're interested in things because you're a little more of a gamer that most people are not interested in. So one dimension of that is harder. But another dimension of that is maybe it's a little more difficult to see the point, which is a different kind of difficulty.
Different kind of difficulty
rather than execution difficulty. Right? And maybe another one is just, with the long cloud thing, it's like being a little bit more absurd in a way that, like if that were the first puzzle in the game that everybody had to play, nobody would get to the second puzzle in the game, right? But at the end, for people who signed up for it, it's better. And it also just has natural properties that are good, like the fact that there's a cloud sitting there is a big mystery, and the fact that there's a callback to it only understood by some small percentage of people who get through it is pretty cool. It's pretty interesting. So there's some picture like that, right? So when I said harder, it's sort of two different things. It's that the experience itself is more difficult, and I don't expect most people to finish even if they start, but it is also that it's okay for individual puzzles to be harder. Those are correlated, but they're different things. But it also doesn't mean it's necessary for them to be harder.
OK， 大体わかったね。这看过了啊，这边应该是连在一起，所以这个就是 personal game 跟 professional game 商业游戏最大的区别。商业游戏为了卖，你要考虑到大多数人的这个利益。一些这种私人的游戏，它不需要考虑。他刚刚典型的说法就是，我也没有上来就发现星星的存在。如果你不通过任何提示是自己发现的话，即便这个东西很复杂，设计的很刁钻，我相信这段这个感觉，那一瞬间的感觉，灵光一现的感觉，还是非常的巧妙。这就跟你不通过任何攻略，在主线去通关找拼图是一样的。当然，那个难度稍微低一点。现在难度更高，那么自然而然你获得了这个成就感，收益就更大。但只有极少部分玩家能获得这东西，不是说正因为只有极少部分玩家能获得，所以你就把这东西难度降低。这种想法嘛，如果你为了销量，为了大众化，那当然需要考虑这个问题。但是这个作者他表达的意思是不需要考虑，因为任何事情都有两面性，是吧？你把难度降低，有更多的玩家第一次不通过攻略就能发现，但是这个曲高和寡，一旦高了，难度高了，那么他们这么一小部分玩家能得到更加优秀极致的体验。They sign up for it， 就跟你充了会员一样，是会员极致体验。然后你现在把这个会员的门槛降低了，但是自然而然感觉也就变差了。所以两面性嘛，他是选择了这个那种感觉。 creating and breaking patterns from a later follow-up discussion， 没看过吗？这 breaking pattern 不是看过，听过嘞，这看过了。
There are exceptions.
这应该看过了。
It's not. This is not a game of ironclad consistency everywhere.
嗯。
And I think that's just part of what makes it.
啊，这个是那段的后半是吧？
You know, you can imagine generating a simple algorithmic pattern, like a square wave or something, and you can convince people that it's very advanced and refined because it's so repeatable and so perfect. But at the same time, it's like, well,
yeah, 这没看
it's
过。
kind of boring to look at and kind of boring to listen to. And if you were to add some more things to that shape in occasional places, then you get
Both.
You get the square wave part. People recognize the shape, but then they also can notice the deviations from the shape. And that's actually similar to what we were saying in the interview about breaking patterns, right? Establishing patterns and then getting a little bit more juice out of breaking the pattern. It's a little bit different.
It's very musical as well in some sense. I mean, everyone kind of intuitively knows that their favorite song has a lot of repetition in it, but it is not just one measure repeated the entire time. What oftentimes makes a song interesting is one part where we change from one thing to another, or where we put in a particular flourish
Shit.
that isn't in the rest of the repetitious part of the song, right? So, like, I would think that people kind of intuitively, at some sense, know that an exact algorithm repeated over and over again is not what feels the best to experience.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, another way to explain this too for computer people is the information theory angle, right?
Mhm.
Which is that, you know, if you take some model as like surprise is enjoyable or new information is enjoyable, right? What is new information? It's a deviation from what you can predict, right? Now, in order to predict things, you need to have a thesis about what the next thing is going to be, which means you need to observe and detect a pattern that you know how to continue in your mind, and then surprise can happen, right? If you don't put the surprise in, if you just do the pattern, that's better than randomness probably, but it becomes boring because there's no new information, right?
And at the same time, you have to have the ability to have that consistency, because otherwise it's also not surprising, because in a thing of randomness, nothing is a surprise. Anything goes. And so it's not really all that surprising to you because there was no pattern to break. So it's almost like you need both. You have to have a balance between both. You can't just do one or the other.
所以还是需要这个 Muratori 来总结一下。The original World 1 was something else。这不是 World 1，这是 World 2。
The idea was that the rewind was a surprise, right?
Right.
And so before World 2, there was actually World 1.
Yes, there was.
And World 1 was you play this platformer and it's got the monsters and stuff on it, and there's no
Cosmic Zero.
rewind.
Right.
And so that you can do even less with that, right?
Right, right.
But it's a little bit like, well, jump on the guys' heads and practice jumping over pits and stuff. And the thing is, because in the rules of the world there are death conditions, there just were.
Yeah.
And in that one, you
还有
would respawn at the beginning.
Right.
And then later, in World 2, you would get the ability to rewind, right? And that seemed good to me, except I already kind of knew, you know, like when a movie comes out where like the reason you're supposed to watch it is because, like, I don't know, 2012 or some ridiculous movie like that, where
Right.
like, oh, it's because the world's getting destroyed in this movie.
Right.
You can't have that be like a surprise that you devote sufficient dramatic time to
Right.
in the movie, because
Right.
everybody knows this thing.
Okay,
And
so,
like-
so you figured when this game came out, people would talk about it or see trailers, and it's like they would already know that there's rewind, so it's just kind of
It seemed like a danger.
a lame duck
Danger.
thing.
That was one of the elements I was thinking about, but there
Okay.
were some other ones like, well, respawning with infinite lives is almost a superpower of its own. That's not as good as rewind, but like it's diminishing rewind to have like, oh, you just respawn at the start of the level or whatever.
Okay.
And I could put lives in and whatever, and then have it be, hey, isn't it cool that the lives don't matter anymore? But that seemed like a big conceit.
Yeah.
And also, it just seemed like the gameplay before Rewind just wasn't going to be that good. And so I had this worry. So again, I have no reason to believe anyone's going to play this game, right?
Right.
Like, Sean had released Chromatron and like 100
Right.
people played it or something.
Right.
So I was like, it's bad to have people play through a whole world that's maybe even a little bit hard or something.
Right.
And not even know why the game's supposed to be good.
Right.
So, like, why not let them know right away? And again, I mean, this goes to the Psalm 46 speech again. Like, let them know right away why the game's good.
Yeah.
You know, why do this thing? And so the idea of Rewind being a surprise was a little bit fun, but I was like, in reality, it's probably not going to work, and so I'm not going to worry about it. But for quite a while, the game had a World 1 where you just don't die. And
Yeah.
you've just got to get to the end of it.
Yeah.
啊，这样
Well, and that's the other thing. Like, it was sort of inherently hard because there's nothing else. There's no other challenge, maybe apart from getting to the end of the world. I mean, maybe you could have had the puzzle pieces all off to the side. I don't know. It just seems like a nothing burger, right?
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
able to walk through that world and like there's nothing going on.
Right.
I had been in person earlier at Brian Moriarty's lecture at the GDC, The Secret of Psalm 46, which is
Mhm.
one of his more famous lectures.
Mhm.
And if you're curious about that, it exists in its entirety in The Witness,
Yes.
which you can, although it's hard to get to. But if you get to it, you get to listen to the whole thing.
Yes. If you're serious about it, you will beat the entire Witness and watch it there.
Yes. If you're a gamer, so one of the things that he was saying in that speech is that like things that are powerful, like things that are fundamental are generous, right?
Mhm.
I'm going to paraphrase really badly because it's
Mhm.
been a while since I listened to it,
Mhm.
but like the world is just generous in there's like a lot of air for you
Mhm.
to breathe,
Mhm.
and there's like a lot of surprise and a lot of and part of what he was expressing in that talk was frustration with sort of the limited thinking of game developers, right? And the way that I make you care about stuff is artificial scarcity, right? Which is weird though, because he's also talking a lot about this masquerade thing, which sort of is artificial scarcity. There's something in that talk that I never fully resolved for myself about exactly what side he was on, right? And this isn't the exact phrase, but he says something like, profound things are generous. The magic is right there.
Yes.
If what people want is invincibility, just give it to them. I really like that speech, and that had been floating around in my head also. Like, again, I didn't know how to action that. I mean, obviously you could make a platformer where the character is invincible, but like, okay, why is that good?
Right.
Right? And so those were all the seeds of this thing, and they came together at this time.
artificial scarcity 这个应该叫什么？人为制造的稀缺是吧？就那举个极端的例子，就是一切都有的要啥有啥的这个大佬，他想寻求一点刺激怎么办呢？他就主动给自己找稀缺，比如说看看自己什么地方缺了，感觉不足，然后再去争取。否则，如果你什么都有了，你还需要干嘛呢？就差不多是感觉吧，就人为制造的这稀缺的感觉。
Why is it like a 2D platformer from like because there are many things you could have done. You could have done something more like a top-down sort
这个
of
好像也没看过。
thing, or you
Yeah.
could have decided it should have been in 3D,
3D.
or you could have. So there was something that made you pick that. Was that just hey, a random first guess? and it
Platformer
stuck,
还是要
or
还是
were
要
you like, there's a
2D。
reason.
There are two reasons,
Okay.
two lines of reasoning that
Yeah.
came together.
OK，
One was, hey, when I first went into games industry, didn't even feel like the industry at the time, but doing this bolt action stuff.
Yeah.
We did some really hard, challenging thing, and we only had 2 programmers. Like, imagine anyone in the year 2022 saying, I've got a 2-person programming team. We're going to build our own game engine that doesn't even use the graphics API, and
Right.
it's going to be drop in, drop out, client server, narrow bandwidth action game,
Yeah.
and we're going to make it in like a year or 2 years.
Yeah.
It's like nobody these days would even try that, and
Right.
like we somehow did it without even being in games.
Right.
Okay.
So I get getting 3D out of the mix, But now there are many different types of 2D games. There's top-down, there's isometric, there's
Yeah, let me go back to
platform.
that for a second, right? Because so like I said, I'd had a hard time firstly with bolt action, but we made a game. We made
Yes.
several iterations of it. It shipped to people.
Yes.
It was grueling, but we did it, and we were
Yes.
poor all the time and all
Yes.
that. After that, like I said, I was kind of burned out. I worked on other projects like Gallstaff, and there was probably other 3D stuff before Gallstaff, and like everything I did was trying to be 3D in some way. You know, the air guitar game was trying to parse 3D space,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Like that's even harder.
Yeah.
I definitely noticed the pattern, and you know, so Happy Cake, for example, as we discussed, was completed
Also
and
3D.
3D. It was a lot of work. We got it done, but also the delta between that and a game that I would have liked was like still pretty big, right?
Mhm.
And so I had a good taste for how hard 3D was. I knew that I could do it, but I also knew that it was going to take a lot of time and energy to do it, both technically, firstly, but also in terms of design. Just getting things to feel good in 3D is harder.
Yeah.
Solving issues like, oh, there's just visibility problems here, or collision doesn't feel good, or whatever it
Right.
is. Those are all easier just from a design standpoint in 2D
Yeah.
than 3D,
I see.
right? And so what I was saying to myself was, you know, I would have envisioned that I would have done a big, groundbreaking, meaningful game. I was about to say important, but I don't know what important means, and I don't think I would have said it that way. But
Okay.
like, I wanted to really make my contribution to games, and I hadn't made a game that was like that yet.
Okay.
Right? Even so Happy Cake didn't ship to anybody. The bolt action game was played by a 3 or 4 digit number of people,
Right.
you know, and then didn't continue after that.
Right.
So it's like, when am I going to do this thing, and what do I do to maximize the probability that this time this project succeeds, right? And there were many things. I was like, it's time to get serious and stop
Okay.
playing around on all these little projects. Now, we've talked through a lot of the consulting that I did. We talked through a few of the projects that I did, but like there were a lot of little projects. And when we skimmed over like Game Developer Magazine, right? I
Right.
did that for like 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like 20 to 30 little projects.
Yeah, yeah.
That whole thing.
Yeah.
It was nuts.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, let's stop messing around and make a game that's really good. So firstly, eliminate technical challenge and design challenge by being 2D.
by being 2D。作为一款这个平台 platformer 的游戏，其实2D 的优秀的作品应该比3D 要多吧？因为3D 就刚刚说了，有很多这样那样的问题。就如果你要在2D 这方面做到80分，是会比3D 做到80分要简单不少。然后剩下的精力你可以投入在别的地方。所以经常现在就看到一些游戏，画面很精美，你看这宣传片很不错，刚进去半小时1小时很不错，到后面就变得很无聊。很多3D 游戏因为没办法，你要花更多时间来处理这些东西，再加上实际的表现，尤其是 platformer， 别的一些游戏当然3D 这个身临其境的感觉肯定比2D 要好，但 platformer 其实不一定这样。比如精确操作，像3D 你就很难，因为多一个维度嘛，多一个维度你很难确认这个精确的感觉，而2D 你是能一眼望到头的，你跳起来你基本就能知道落脚点大概在哪儿。3D 这个问题是很严重，所以很多时候只能作为试验品。如果你要把2D 的这个难度放到3D 的话，那直接这个难度系数直接就往上不知道提升了多少。然后突然对这个 Jonathan Blow 感兴趣，我就觉得他的这个 education 应该挺厉害的。Occupation 现在是 Game Designer Programmer 啊，游戏开发者跟程序员。但是你要作为这种独立游戏开发者，你队伍团队里面肯定需要有这个 programmer， 这是必须的。即便你不是 main programmer， 你肯定也要有些基本常识。像我这样的小白，你说什么我根本听不懂，那肯定不太行。Education 是 University of California Berkeley dropped out 啊 ，dropped out， 这就都是有想法的人，能进伯克利然后 drop out。Three easy pieces。more about pattern， 这个应该看过了。How pattern breaks OK， 应该可以。这个蛮简单扫一下。顶上是顶上是吧？顶上的什么东西？
So now
啊，这看过。
Because of, right.
Why they don't hope and that's already very good.
Not what you mean.
I think what I just said for anyone listening is the best
看过
explanation that I've ever given of this thing
Of that thing. Okay.
to anyone else.
Where and chapters
at that point, you're not having that. Yeah.
哦，好操，这是倒过来的是吧？啊，它梯子是反过来的，设计的好弱智，操！哎，这个在这儿吗？啊，这个确实在这儿，顶上的怎么着？顶上的那个，我觉得应该是那什么 Star 吧，去看一下。能设计出这种游戏想法如此刁钻的，肯定不是一个善茬。你基本上是能知道的，所以伯克利也算是在预期范围内了。撤，跳一下。
Whereas if they're a little bit different, if they're doing things that are, whereas if they're a little bit different, if they're doing things that are a little bit absurd. So one of the most famous star puzzles.
啊，看了。Most famous star puzzle.
Whereas to where you're, like when you're hanging out with your buds, you can do more of that stuff, right?
Sure.
啊，这个是。
A different example of a pattern happens, but then they have right blog. That's like interacting with up to that point. Look
Okay.
all of a sudden, right? You get published by the game up to that point, but I'm not in danger of disrupting the game because this is a
tiny part at the end,
right? I don't think this idea was there from the very beginning, but at some point I had some idea that like I was gonna have a little bit of a shock surprise.
这好像没看过。
Because like Mario games are kind of for kids and are infantilizing and all of these things.
Okay.
And if you like go very mature or whatever at the end, that would be a way to, I don't know, be surprising and show that it's an art. Like, look, who would do something like this in a video game?
Right. Like they cook the man for dinner at the end of the movie or whatever. It's like now you're pretty sure this isn't for kids.
Yeah. And so that had been the premise for a while. And there were versions of the story that
小朋友玩他们说词嘛那样的。
The thing is, I just decided eventually that like
文字量也大，故事也深，解谜也不简单。
Right.
Okay.
It's just like I want to do something better than that. That is a relatively, how would I say it? Like if you're looking around and you're saying there's all this kid stuff, and so I'm going to do something that's not
kid stuff. 也这个倒挺有意思。
That's still a thing that someone who isn't totally an adult would be concerned with. Because if you are an adult, it's no big deal.
Okay.
You know, you go online and you get insulted by people all the time, and you can tell who they are by what they do.
Yeah.
So, like once in a while, people say to me like,
You are not.
you know, I say something that they don't like, and they're like, "Oh my God, you're so immature. This is ridiculous." And I'm like, "Wait, how old do you think I am? Because I'm not worried about being immature right now.
Yeah,
That's
of course.
just not a thing that's on the table for me. But because you think
it is, I need to care.
You're probably in your 20s or something, right? And I just know this, right? And so it's kind of like that. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I'm going to have this game not be totally kid stuff, and I'm going to do an adult-ish thing. And that just seemed a little bit childish at some point. And I think I knew it was the whole time, and I just didn't have a better idea.
Interesting.
So, for example, The Witness is a pretty damn adult game.
Yeah.
Like, I can't really think of something that's more of a game for adults than that.
Okay.
Aside from like a very long, boring Sudoku game or
Sudoku.
something.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But it isn't that way because of anything gimmicky. It's just the sensibility, right? And so the problem was my conception of how this thing would end was a little bit gimmicky because it had a little bit of like M. Night Shyamalan to it that was not helpful.
I don't think I ever saw such this twist ending
Okay.
you're talking about. Maybe.
The point being,
Okay.
though, I had some plan of what the arc was.
Okay.
And then eventually I decided that's not a good arc.
Okay.
I am disappointed with this arc. And so I'm going to do something that I am less disappointed in. it is also going to be less comprehensible to most people.
I see.
But you know what? I'm just
Just
gonna
going to
do
what I
want
want to
It's
do.
my
对，
game.
这句话总结了一切。
My rules.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened there. And I was very aware while doing it that it's going to be even less linear conceptually. It's going to be even
Right.
harder to read as a conventional story. And I didn't care.
即便到
I was
现
just
在
like,
也
look, this
我也
is
不
what
是
I
很
want
懂
to do.
他这句话只有跟他差不多的 nuts 才能听得懂。在一般人看来，我觉得能听懂，你也只是认可这种想法而已，你并不能真正的去理解这种 I just want to do what I want to do。
Now, there's the epilogue, which we mentioned, and
看过了。
puzzles that
对
give you at the
demarcating，
beginning a
这
mission
看不
that
懂。
which lets if there is
这有
right?
puzzle 吗？
So that's like extremely intrinsic and unguided. And
Unguided.
So the epilogue is maybe an intermediate area between those things.
啊，对，靠，忘了。哎，那不是回不去了吗？对啊，好像回不去了。也现在一些这个老牌的游戏 IP 变得越来越无聊，是不是也是因为这个原因？我好像稍微有点反应过来了。実はそうではないじゃない。你拿那个现在最常见的宝可梦跟怪猎举例，你照理来说，2010年前，宝可梦可能是一个比较复杂的话题。2010年前的怪猎呢，这么硬核是吧？有这么多小朋友会玩吗？是属于很高难度，当然会有啊。当然，这个游戏你的目标的群体并不应该是小朋友，是吧？不应该是 childish game， 不应该是 kids game。现在呢，越来越往这种社交元素定龄化发展了，因为难度降低，很明显就是这个定龄化的标志，是吧？定龄化加一个社交，就越来越不硬核。宝可梦呢是一个比较，这刷出来的地方，我还以为你要从这儿上去。当年的宝可梦看起来是一个小朋友的游戏，但真正研究生的其实都是一些成年人，就表面上的披了这个 childish game 的外衣，但实际上玩的成年人很多，反而是一些枪战游戏，非常快乐的枪战游戏。你以为很多这个成年人在疯狂的刷，其实那些游戏才是小朋友比率比较高的，比如说像什么 CS 的 CF 这种，这是真实数据表明的。但现在这个数字已经发生了变化了，就在当时看起来非常幼稚，但其实成年人玩的很多游戏，现在好像成年人玩的越来越少了，真正的变成了这个 childish game， 有这个发展趋势，就真正把这些能够深入剖析或者说高端一些竞技的东西给它拔掉，越来越低龄化、快餐化。你这个趋势一旦完了之后，就是轻玩家，轻玩家就是这个富裕游戏的代表，有这个趋势。就本来说这个 Pokemon game is childish game 是一个嘲讽，现在已经不是嘲讽了，现在真正我觉得是一个标签了。所以你想钻研、想认真玩的，我看该退坑了。一方面是因为年龄问题，年纪到了；另外一方面，我觉得跟这个游戏 IP 的定位也是有关系，越来越市场化。当你注重销量，你就只能这么搞。老玩家不如狗，对不对？那些这个10年前就已经20岁，或者10年前那会儿10岁左右的小屁孩，现在都已经几岁了，是吧？这些都是老玩家，你觉得这些老玩家不如狗，那么你就只能把你的目光投向现在的小朋友了，那就去毒害他们。An idea about breaking pattern， 这个没看过吗？
There's an idea that I tend to have about games,
这边应该能看过，
which
这么多。
is the following. You can just do some stuff and it's just kind of random and not coherent, and that's not very good. Right? And so one of the ways that you do to fix that is you establish a pattern that people can understand.
这概念
either
可能听过，
consciously or
但
subconsciously.
这段不好说。
In this game, it's that things are about time, and here's how long the worlds are, and there's a dinosaur at the end, and all of that, right?
Right. 12 puzzle pieces, put them together, etc., etc.
And that gives you, I mean, I don't know what the right language is, but there's some kind of value to that. There's an amount of good gameness that you get out of that approach.
It's like a predictability of some aspect of the game
Yes.
that helps hold it together, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, but it's deeper and subtler than that.
Okay.
Right? There are many aspects to it. Right?
Okay.
All sorts of things, like the feeling that the player is in good hands with the designer comes from this,
Right.
for example.
Right.
Their ability to solve puzzles comes from them understanding what the hell is expected from them, and,
Right,
and all
right.
sorts of things like that.
Yes.
So this is where value comes from. And you could be more good or less good about establishing those patterns and sticking to them, right? Consistently. If you don't establish the patterns solidly enough, even if you as a designer think that they're there, the players won't realize that they're there, and they won't work as well as you would think. Now, suppose you do a good job establishing those patterns and following those patterns. Then what? Is there more value to get after that? And I think the answer is yes.
Okay.
Because once you've established a pattern, there is now surprise in breaking the pattern.
Okay.
And breaking the pattern is not coherent if you have not established the pattern, because it just seems like randomness.
Okay.
But once the pattern is there, if you break it, then it's an extra moment that the player gets to have on top of what they have already had.
Right. Clear enough. Tuning the game so that twitchy gameplay won't block your ability to solve puzzles.
Not only is this a puzzle game, not an action game, but what does that mean? Let's come up with a strong statement about what that means, because the stronger and clearer the statement, the more it can guide design decisions. Whereas the statement, this is a puzzle game, not an action game, is not necessarily, again, actionable in the sense that there still needs to be some more steps between that and telling you the answer to decisions.
Right.
So here's a stronger version of that statement, which I very explicitly formulated to myself.
Okay.
Because it is a puzzle game, not an action game. Once you figure out the answer to a puzzle, you should then just be able to solve the puzzle. There should not be an action element that is hard that you also need to be able to do.
就关键是把难度放在前半了。
So that's a statement about solutions.
制定剧本是关键。
And then you can walk that one step to what do you do as a player who doesn't know the solution? You attempt solutions.
Right. Yeah.
If you have a concrete idea about what solution you are attempting, it should not be dexterity based to the greatest extent possible. It should simply be that you try the thing. Now, I think in the game as it stands today, this was not completely successful just because you watch people who are new at the game.
操作还是有难度吧。
They're trying to jump on a monster's head, they miss,
对
or whatever. Like all these things happen.
还是有点
We
难度。
also know for a fact, because it has now been documented indelibly,
That Brian
that
Moriarty,
Brian Moriarty
could
could
not
not finish Braid, despite being one of the people who has played more hours of The Witness than anyone on planet Earth, because he could not successfully jump on one of the bounce, not Goombas, because that's trademarked, monsters.
Yes.
Goombas.
Now, he may just be much less of an action gamer than most people as well.
Maybe.
Also, though, standards are really different today than even they were back then. Like, in the 2000s, there were hard platformers. And if you go back to the 80s or the 90s, platformers were really hard. Because that was just the only way to get gameplay out of them, really.
那会儿没有想法，就是操作。
Also, there's probably an expectation in 2008, because there hasn't been the iPhone gaming scene and all these other things, that anyone who would find a sure-to-be esoteric game like Braid, which is probably what you're thinking when it comes out, will be a relatively accomplished gamer. That turned out not to be the case, but at the time, no one would have thought, like, oh, all of these potentially casual gamers might check this out, or that isn't what anyone would have been thinking. Probably,
and you know, so what I would just say is this decision was successful, and I did this statement about there shouldn't be an action barrier to solving things was very clearly successfully executed relative to the platformers of 2000 to 2005, which were like very hard, made for gamers and whatever, right? There are also other design parameters to this, right? So for example, how could you make it easier to jump on monsters? Well, maybe if I slow them down so that it's more like they're in one spot and they move slowly, it's easier to target because you're sort of more targeting a space on the ground than where they are. The problem is that has a pacing effect across the entire game.
Mm.
Now,
Yes.
anytime anybody's solving a puzzle, it takes a lot longer.
Right, right,
and
yeah.
slower and all this stuff, right?
Yes.
And then, like, okay, I have a certain amount of space for rewind
这个就
buffers.
是有利有弊。
If that's like 20 minutes on the most complicated level, if it takes 3 times as long for the monster to go, that's effectively 6 minutes,
Yeah.
right? It starts
Yeah.
getting scary. Like, these
Yeah.
kind of things happen.
嗯
So I think I did a good job given the context I was working in.
Yeah.
But I don't think you can objectively say that there's no
right right。
Right.
action skill required
Right,
to solve puzzles
right.
because
这
there
不可能
definitely
全部
is.
解
It's
决嘛
just not that much compared to what it would have
Could
been in
have
another
been, yeah.
game
Could
or
have
what
been.
it would have been if I had decided that this was an action game.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
这款解谜动作游戏从我的体验上来说，确实把重心放到解谜上了，而没有放到动作上。当然，如他所说，即便你不算星星，也是还是有这样的东西的。比如说那关需要大跳的，那个 high jump 才能跳上去，那个东西肯定需要一点 execution。如果你实在是手残，这类游戏不太接触过，那么即便你知道你的答案，即便你想出答案了，这时候可能你还不确定你的答案是不是对的，那你可能会浪费不少时间。或者说，即便你已经知道你的答案肯定正确了，你还需要花，比如说别的玩家的几倍，尝试好几次才能过去。这种是不可能完全避免嘛。因为如果说你要避免，就意味着你要把难度降低。像刚刚他说的，把这个怪的移动速度变慢，那么你蹦他脑袋上是容易的，但也会有别的问题，所以只能说是一个 compromise。这点上是没什么问题的。在开制作前，其实我不知道制作有什么太难的，打了2、3期之后，我才发现这个难度确实有一点，但更多的确实是体现在这个思路上。操作的话也就极个别，不算星星极个别，星星倒是算，但他已经说了，星星不是给每个玩家准备的，是要你要有想法，你为什么要获取那个星星，对吧？你为什么要在这个游戏干等2个小时就为了拿那颗星星？你要搞清楚这个问题，那么你就能理解为什么开发者要放这么东西在这儿。Why the jumps are not very high compared to some other popular games. Keeping puzzles easy to think about. Concluding the discussion of jump height. 这应该就那个 hunt 啊，对。Not all， 去看那个。啊，这儿
We've discussed the
看过
we've
了。
the actual in particular would tend to note some difference. In retrospect, we should have done several variants of that cloud screen door though, because the whole point is that we lay them out in a line. So one of the things about the game, there's like a HUD on there would just be like our is so one of the things about the game we've already aware on top is like are different
Okay.
the kind of thing that I was doing and wanted to
I
do,
see.
right?
Okay.
所以讨论这个跳跃高度马里奥这个问题早就
You
看过了。
said that in this game, the jumps are much.
对对对对，这早就已经看过6分24。上古时期的东西。
The
Right.
and so
It's like okay.
这个就是
act
cross
lot
reference,
is just drastically different.
drastically
yeah,
different.
and like the conceptual focus of the game is in a totally different place, right?
Yeah.
And you need as a designer to be maintaining that at all times.
Okay.
Decided early on, Braid's a puzzle game, and do the play hard is to game.
啊，
but
这
it's
个也
much
看过
more
了。
visual time, but
17
keeping
things in order.
on a screen
Ah,
because that removes a lot of this incidental difficulty, right?
Right.
So that leads to
啊，compact designs。
compact designs that are simpler in terms of number of walls and number of rooms and
Right.
whatever.
Right.
然后就最后这个右边这东西了，concluding the discussion， 6分钟。
We've now stated two constraints. We've said puzzles are about it being difficult to get to a particular place,
嗯
which often, reading between the lines, this is a game with gravity and you jump and
对，这个就是 high
platforms,
jump。
so
Right.
usually up is
这
hard.
个跳肯定
Right,
难的
yes.，
Or across to some place that is separated by something you would fall down.
一个是高，一个是远嘛。
And we want puzzles to fit on one screen. Okay? So the height that you jump
Right.
determines how interesting the puzzles can be.
Right.
And it needs to be short enough that you can fit a
Yep.
puzzle of the interest level that you want, of the maximum interest level that you
Right.
want on one screen.
Okay.
Right? If that's not
Shit, my
true,
boots.
if you jump half the screen, And a puzzle could only ever be like 2 jumps max.
Yeah, you could almost see this in something like going from Donkey Kong. I never thought of it this way, but in going from Donkey Kong to Super Mario Brothers, if you had the Super Mario Brothers jump in Donkey Kong, the entire game would take 2 jumps. You just jump to the
Yes.
mid-level and jump right to the top, right? So you can immediately see, like, yeah, the complexity that you want on one screen
Yeah.
tells you exactly how high
How
the
high a
jump
jump
can
can
be.
be.
'Cause if it's higher than that, you can't make the game.
Yeah.
Like literally.
Yeah.
Right?
Now, okay. So everything that I just said here is very particular to Braid specifically.
Right.
Mhm.
But the meta skill that I would encourage people to develop is
Yes.
a priori, while figuring out what your game is, to be able to see enough of this kind of constraint for your domain that you're working in, that you then can do something much closer to the right thing out of the gate than you would otherwise, right? There is this old idea in games, and it seemed true at the time when people were saying this. The idea was, oh, you know, you can design a game, but the first time a player actually meets your game, they're just gonna, the play test result is gonna be totally different than
Right.
anything you ever expected, and that's
Yeah.
why you have to play test and
Yeah,
iterate,
yeah.
and you can't really a priori design. And like, that's a little bit true, but it's actually not that true. Like, if you're a good designer, you actually should kind of know what's gonna happen.
有意思。就是如果你没有经历过这个事情，你又怎么能预见到的结果呢？但对于真正专业的来说，他不一定需要经历，他也能预见。这也是差不多类似的感觉。啊，这里还有2个，有多少大来呢？那边是一个3连，是一个数字3连。那这个3连肯定要看掉，这个2个看情况。关键看这3个有多长，这你从哪儿到哪儿？ Light, beautiful design versus heavy, ponderous design.
The end result just wasn't good.
Good
Like,
night.
Right.
okay, I'm doing this interaction and that's cool, but I'm not getting more out of the interaction than I put in. That's part of the magic of design, right? Is
I
you
see.
find the thing where you do a certain amount of contrivance or a certain amount of setup for the situation, and then you get out of it all these cool things as fuel, as like payload for your game, right?
Oh,
It's
wow.
like splitting a molecule or something, and
I
the
was
energy
just going to
comes
say
out.
that. So
Yeah.
that's a really interesting way to put it, and I don't think I've ever thought about it that way. So basically what you're saying is you have to think about the design process almost like you were thinking about a power plant. If it's
Yes.
costing you more to get design things out as what you're actually implementing to put in, you're probably doing something wrong, and you should try to look at a different thing or
Yes.
move to a different space, because all you're going to end up doing is making a very Procrustean thing with not a lot of richness. Is that a kind of fair summary?
Absolutely. And I've played lots and lots of games by
Yeah.
people who didn't get that. Because
Yeah.
if you follow, you know, there have been presentations at conferences about how do you design games? How do you design
Right.
puzzle games? And it's
Right.
like, come up with different mechanics that do
Yeah.
things. And it's like, okay, but all these ideas that you put into your game and implement have cost, right? Firstly, your implementation cost,
Yes.
your maintenance cost of making sure that when they interact, forget even the interactions being interesting, but like your game has to survive the interaction of things, right?
Right.
It has to do something that makes sense and is playable.
You have to have a plan for, can the art represent it and all these other
Represent
knock-on
it at
effects?
all,
Yeah.
and then in a way that feels like the player can get what's going on,
Yeah.
right? Like there's a rule that I have that I think some people understand, which is, you know, if you have a lot of invisible game state, especially in a single player game,
Yeah.
it's very hard to play and it's very inscrutable.
Yeah.
And so the role of like graphics and sound effects and vibration and whatever else is in part to help communicate that hidden state so that you can learn it better and
Yeah.
understand better what's going on.
Yeah.
So if you make a bunch of rules with a bunch of weird hidden state, you're making that job very difficult to do and you know, maybe impossible.
You see that, I think, a lot in like RPGs, especially like tabletop inspired RPGs, where like they've implemented this big rule set that like a dungeon master would have been reading from,
Yeah.
but it's almost impossible to surface that to a player who isn't familiar with
Ah.
that tabletop game. I've definitely had that experience myself. Like, I don't know how it's determining how much damage this spell is. I have no idea, right?
Yeah.
There's numbers everywhere and all this stuff, and it's just like, I believe you that you've got something in there that's doing it. It also kind of reminds me of something from UI design I've noticed separately, which is like, the harder it is to program a UI's logic control flow in your code, usually the less good the UI is.
Ah.
Because there's just too much stuff that might be happening for the user to really understand, and you know.
Oh, we have a lot of bad UI these days.
Okay, well, that all makes very good
the
sense.
other thing to say about that, right? It's not just these other internal things that I
Yeah.
said, but like the other costs are, what does the player have to learn to play your game, and then what do they have to think about to solve puzzles?
Yeah.
And what do you have to think about to design puzzles? And these are
Yeah.
very insidious costs
Okay.
because you can be paying them and not realize it. And
Right.
and that is a thing to avoid. So I've played a bunch of puzzle games where there's just a lot of setup of different objects that they quote teach you about.
Right.
And then it's like, here's a level with these things. And what do you do in the level? It's like you just kind of untangle what they set up in the level. And
Yep.
there's no deeper, more enlightening principle to it. There's no
Yep.
surprise. There's no revelation.
Yep.
There's no you getting better at anything aside from untangling messy situations in your head.
Yep.
Which after you've done that a couple times, it's just the same thing over and over again.
Yep.
Right. And so that is a failure mode that a lot of puzzle games fall into. And the designers of those games do not even see after they've done it that they fell into that. They're just, what? It's a puzzle game. Look, I made the puzzle game. If you understand, I did the thing where you put the mechanics, you have the things with different mechanics that are combined to solve the puzzle, and here they are in some rooms. And obviously players can sit down and solve this puzzle, so I made a good puzzle game. And it's like, well, no, the good part
Yes.
is very presumptuous, right?
Yes.
Good is difficult, and it is something that we have not done a very good job talking about. Really ever.
Because I often look for resources that are good for this sort of thing and don't find them.
Yeah.
Ensuring the puzzles contain meaningful ideas.
Puzzles where you just grind away and then you come to some solution, and the solution does not feel special in any way,
Yeah.
and you don't know anything new.
这两个先放一下。
Those are relatively thankless puzzles that feel like work, and after you
Yeah.
do a bunch of those, you'll like nope out of a game or
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
right? On the other hand, if you solve a puzzle and you're like, oh my god, I get it, that is by definition
a good puzzle.
a more enjoyable experience, like a more punchy experience, and it will lead you to liking a game more, right? Now, Valve, the problem is they're very focused on, they think of their game as a product, right? And they're iterating on product design. And so from that standpoint,
Yeah.
this whole aha moment thing makes sense because it's the way to get your customer to like your game.
Yes.
Right. And that is all true. But I think my standpoint has always been it's missing some things. Both in terms of why does your life have meaning if you're a designer of this stuff?
Yeah.
And also, okay, so coming up with aha moments, like what is actionable about this, right?
Yeah.
How do I make these things, and,
Yeah.
and how do I make them good versus not good?
Yeah.
Because this whole idea of the aha moment, again, it's true, but it's incomplete. And so what I tell people to think about is, okay, what is that aha moment for, first of all?
Okay.
Is it just to get people to play your game? Is it just the equivalent of, like, in an RPG, we give people a little bit more loot on a certain schedule so that they feel compelled to keep bashing the monsters, right? Or is there more to it? Can you, if you think you're an artist, then you should have some opinion about the content of those moments,
Mhm.
right? Like, imagine somebody, making a film.
Mm-hmm.
When, at some point you have characters get emotional and they reveal things about their
Right.
personality or
Right.
whatever, right? You can take that in a very cynical way that's like, okay, so to make my film interesting, I'm going to do these paced at certain points
Right.
throughout the running time. And
Right.
as long as I put them with enough density, then people will sit all the way through the movie, right?
Yes.
And that's kind of what Valve was saying to some extent, right?
Right.
But okay, so firstly, if I'm an artist, I care about what exactly these characters are and
Yeah.
what they're saying to each other and how their personalities interact, and that's what I really should be thinking about. And if I really am thinking about that, then maybe it's not a problem to come up with dialogue that creates these interesting moments because I'm working with the interesting subject matter at a more core level,
Yes.
right? And so then I don't need this tip about making sure interesting things are said. And maybe if I follow the tip about making sure interesting things are said, I'm actually going to make kind of bad scripts, right? Whereas if I'm
yeah.
working with the interesting character material, maybe I just naturally get better scripts, right?
At
This
least
is kind of a bad analogy.
it's,
but it is what
no,
it is.
it's not a bad analogy. Because I could probably clean it up a little bit.
Okay.
So
到你
in
书上了。
screenwriting, we do have this exact thing, right? I mean, I don't write screenplays, but I
Yeah.
mean, they have
Yeah.
it. So in screenwriting, you do have this, and I think the problem is people mistake observations about what tends to be true of well-written scripts
Yeah.
for prescriptions on how to write good scripts.
Yes.
And I think the same could be said for game design.
A way that game designers sometimes map out interactivity in a game. Map out.
You've got a game.
10分钟。我操。
and Let's say there's some set of things in
可以
the
吧？把这
game.
听完
Now,。
Well, Braid, there's keys, gates, monsters, right?
Yes. And we'll talk for a minute about
It's
just
probably
like noun
the
kind of
longest one.
things, but
Okay.
if you really want to be comprehensive, like there might be like verbs that you can do, like jumping is a
Right.
verb, not really a noun, right?
Right.
Mm.
But along one axis. And whether the verbs should be listed in what we're about to say or not, it's sort of two different ways of doing it.
Okay.
The easiest way to think about it is just all nouns, right? So
Right.
like you might have player is a noun,
Right.
And monster is a noun.
Yep.
Like Goomba style monster. I
Yep.
don't want to use that word because it's copyright Nintendo.
Okay.
So I'm going to say monster.
Okay.
It's copyright Italy.
Goomba R
Yes.
with a circle.
So this idea of good design,
Mhm.
quote unquote,
Mhm.
with very sarcastic quotes.
Okay.
Not just regular sarcasm quotes.
Okay.
Is that you just want to make sure that any two things interact with each other. And
Mhm.
so does player interact with monster? Why, yes, both by jump, right? I could kill the monster, or a monster overlaps with me
And kills you.
and kills me, right? And so if you make a list of, people have probably seen this kind of matrix where you have, 17 nouns.
Yeah.
You list them both across and down so
Yep.
that everything is cross-referenced to itself along the diagonal.
Like, think of a spreadsheet if you don't know what a matrix is.
Yes.
A spreadsheet where you have the rows and columns. You put all the nouns down the rows and all the nouns across the columns. So now you have a
In
big
the same
square.
order. In the same
In
order.
the same
yeah.
order, you have a big square to fill in.
And the diagonal is just does this thing interact with itself, which you probably ignore, although
Right.
maybe not.
Right.
But so then and in fact everything's redundant because like the upper triangle and the lower triangle are just the transpose.
Yeah,
of each
transpose.
other, so-
Well, I suppose it depends how you look at it. If it's a transitive action where it's like player acts on Goomba is this,
Yeah.
Goomba acts
Well,
on
and
player
in
is
fact,
that,
in this
and it
case-
is in this case.
in this case, yes. So it's
So-
player acts on Goomba would
Yeah.
be via jump.
So it may or
and
may
you-
not be symmetric.
And you could put a check there, and
All
then
right.
Goomba acts on player, kills the player. You could put a check there.
Exactly.
And the idea is you just want check marks in all the boxes,
Right.
and then you have a design space that is not like dead, and that's true. Like, and in fact, earlier games had a lot of dead design space.
Yes.
So it is the kind of thing that you solve. The problem is, though, it's like you're bringing this conceptual machinery to bear to solve what is kind of an easy problem that anyone who becomes a good designer already intuited.
I see.
You know, like if you have things in a game that don't affect each other, you end up in situations where it feels kind of bad or whatever. And the rule that you can learn that's much simpler than draw this matrix and put all the things in it is just your game is often richer if things affect each other.
And you know, it seems to me also that it's maybe phrased a little bit poorly or framed a little bit poorly when presented in the matrix format, because it seems to me it's more interesting to just go, look, this is just a good spot check for you to find possibilities. Like if you're sitting around thinking about something and it's like you kind of a little stuck,
Yeah.
think about, are there any things that you haven't looked at for interactions, and look at possibilities there, because the thing that doesn't really make sense to me about the matrix formulation is games usually don't quite break down that way. Like in Braid, it would suck if monsters and keys didn't interact. That is a worse game if you took that away.
Yeah.
I don't think I know if anything important happens between the like Goomba going like to a cannon or something like this. Like
Well-
there's things where I'm just like, I don't know if that matters, and it's like I wouldn't necessarily think it was bad or good if it did. It's just a possibility.
There are lots of things that don't.
哇，这都有
For。
Yeah.
example, bullet shot out of cannon
Yeah.
does not interact with key in any way. It does not
Okay.
interact with gate in any way.
Okay.
It does not interact with cloud in any way.
Right.
It doesn't interact with, you know, fire pit full of spikes.
I
It
feel
doesn't interact
我
with
操，
stuffed animal dinosaur at the end of the level.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it doesn't interact with
Shit.
book podium.
Right.
Like, and so as we said earlier, this is deliberate for Braid because actually for the design to be good with regard to the perturbations of the rule set that happen with time,
Yeah.
I wanted a stable, simple
rule set。
Yeah.
that was easy to understand. And actually, if I had done this square matrix thing before adding the time rules, I probably would have ended up with a more complicated rule set.
Yes.
And more importantly, one of the things that you get out of that kind of very dense full interaction matrix is like more surprise. Like the player didn't necessarily think that these two objects
Right.
would interact, and maybe it's not even likely.
Yes.
But then once in a while they do interact,
Right.
and something cool happens, and you're like, oh, I should have expected that, and it seems plausible and natural and whatever. And that's enjoyable. I didn't want that.
Right.
I want that to come from the time stuff,
Right.
not from like the baseline stuff.
Yeah.
And so if you go do that with the baseline stuff, you're like doing too good of a job with the baseline stuff, and
Right.
you're crowding out. It's like, you know,
Yes.
if you're mixing a song, and like you want the guitar solo to be
Yes.
the point, but you're turning the drums way up
Yes.
and like whatever
Too much
all the other
cowbell,
things, right?
yeah.
Yes. So that is sort of a meta point, which is that this particular full interactivity space idea is an idea of how to make a game good, and it is contextual whether you want to do that or not. If you have very sophisticated ideas about what you're doing, and you know what you're doing, then you may well do the opposite, in fact. Now, of course, the general heuristic applies that you should know the rules to break the rules, right?
Well, and it's a tool, right? It's like it's something you can use to see what areas you haven't explored, which is useful, as long
Yes.
as you don't feel compelled, right, to fill it all in because you thought that was the point or something. right?
Absolutely, right. Hey, I'm kind of stuck.
Yeah.
This design isn't working for me.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes our mind just isn't that good at. Sometimes it's very good at like honing in on like exactly what's wrong, but
Yes.
sometimes that's hard.
Yes.
And then you can use a tool like that to just put your attention on every, because this space is very intangible. The space of like what
Exactly.
interacts with what,
Yeah.
it's not visible anywhere. And so you could
Right.
look at this matrix and be like, okay, do I want the bullet shot out of the cannon to interact with the ring, the time control ring?
Yes.
Do I want it to hit the time control ring and bump it sideways or
Right.
something? In some games, you might. In this game, I did not.
Right.
Because I didn't want the result of any puzzle to be have the bullet bump the time control ring.
Right.
That would have made a worse game.
Right.
But in a lot of games, it makes a better game.
Right.
So, for example, Spelunky, I think, is one of the most successful examples of a game that leverages this kind of multiple object interaction in a way that has a long lifetime through the game that keeps giving you surprises, and that's delightful and funny, even though it usually results in you losing the game.
Right.
It like feels fair and it feels funny. This is actually in Spelunky 2, I felt it was mistuned to where the game was just really sadistic and I didn't want to play it.
Okay. So something about the first one kind of hit a better.
It worked better for me personally. But yeah, so that kind of thing, again, interesting conceptual tool. Like, you should understand the idea of lining everything up in a matrix.
Yeah.
Because that's a certain kind of illustration of what it means for things to interact. And if you understand that, then you can use it, as you're saying, as a kind of analytical tool occasionally, right? But the failure mode is to think that the goal is to fill out the matrix with check marks, and not only that that's necessary, but that it's sufficient.
Yes.
And almost everybody thinks that is sufficient.
Right.
And that's why we get so many bad puzzle games.
And I would also add a separate thing, which is that it seems to me to be both a bad idea to fill the whole thing out, and also insufficient to fill the whole thing out, because when I think about games and try to map it onto that ontology, I don't know why you would a priori say that it's a 2D matrix. What if I want 3 things to interact in some cases, or 4? Or what if I want these 2 things to interact, but I want there to be 5 different ways they interact, whereas this thing over here, there's only 1. And so again, even if you took it as a prescriptive thing, I'm going to go fill out the whole matrix, as a naive game designer, I walk into that and go, I still don't really know exactly what that means, because there's so many other things I've obviously seen in games that don't actually fit that model, even if we talk about filling it all the way in.
But that's what I meant earlier, or it's an example of what I meant by seeing this kind of device and like reading it in, looking at how it fits in this framework with the other things that you know. Right? And then, does it make a consistent picture, or to what degree does it make a consistent picture? How seriously should I take it? And a lot of people just don't really run that process.
Right.
10分钟，这应该目前最长的一段。这么看的话，这个 Casey Muratori 的部分大概还需要2期多，应该差不多能搞定。看来这个 Screen 的部分 ，Chris Moore 多长了？这好像稍微短一点。Chris Moore 这2期应该差不多能搞定。关键是你不知道一段有多长，这个东西是暂时没法确定。会硌一下是吧？来得及。哇，还是不少的。还是不少的。虽然有些东西已经看过了，这里已经到头了吗？啊，这个2期也不见得能搞定。一段2分钟跟一段10分钟，这个差距就很大。你要每段都10分钟的话，马上得 game 你拿了奶奶 more excuses。啊，这算到头了是吗？他为什么需要这么多东西？这有什么？这有什么意义吗？啊，相杀しないともしかして这里是不能有必要吗？也ちょっと待ってね，看一下。这个东西不受那影响的。这样搞了，不断的冲进去就完了。这边没有什么相杀的意义啊。 好。啊，もしかしてこっちか。啊，他们こっちだな。这个地方你要想看的话，必须要把对，有道理。これ間に合わないですね。さすがに間に合わない。所以需要相杀，这个是唯一一个相杀点。看懂了。然后我记得 programming 应该相对短一点了，2、3期应该是能搞定的。有没有已经看过的部分 ？This area directs you toward commentaries related to programming. Many, but not all, of these are available via other routes through the commentary, but they are gathered here for convenience. 很多看过倒没有吧？啊，这里还真很多看过了，1、2、3、4、5、6、7、8、9、10，一共10个，现在只剩3个了。那这个看的还挺多。しかしお前はかなり邪魔なんですよ。最后一个超级脏，对，最后一个这个超级脏，最后一个超级脏。这个设计的超级脏啊，就没多少了是吧？啊，これはさすがにそこまでいない了。然后2个这个是吧？啊，这个的话1期到2期全能搞定。然后 play 数就不知道了，先这样。这个是真正的天坑。有些这个主题讨论东西还挺有意思的，还是能让人把注意力集中的。有些呢确实听得有点无聊，你说不至于昏昏欲睡，但很容易分神。它这个东西可能还真的有15个小时的 commentary， 那我估计不是15期、20期的问题，可能需要25期，而且我这一期平均时间还超过1个小时，敬请期待。